actually, let's go to Kerala. I'm going to go on a slight diversion. I'm tempted to ask you, are you actually surprised that you don't see more things like rioting in the United States?
Yes, I am surprised.
Okay.
I mean, look,
so.
the fact is that, you were going to ask me about Kerala or
Yes,
Vietnam or things, and I would like to actually bring that into to how I
please.
would answer you. Um, when you create a society where public action is delegitimized, in the United States, there's been almost 100-year attack on trade unions, on people's organizations. I mean, you go back to the raids in 1919, the Palmer raids, then McCarthyism. There's been a long history of attacking trade unions, tethering unions, breaking up people's organization, independent organizations of people. You atomize people, you let them be on their own, then they join relatively illegal and very disturbing type of organizations. That's what happens in places like the United States, where you fragment society. In a place like Kerala, almost everybody is a member of either a trade union, a women's organization, youth organization, student organization, cooperatives, and so on. It's a highly organized society. People don't see themselves as individuals. And by the way, some of the organizations are ascriptive. In other words, they are church groups or they are religious groups or whatever. But people are organized so that when a crisis hits a place like Kerala, public action kicks in immediately. The trade unions come out there, they start feeding people, they build sinks in public, they do all kinds of things. In the United States, when you have a crisis, the magnitude of this pandemic, you don't see the trade unions doing anything. I mean, trade unions have sort of taught themselves to be bargaining units. Where have the trade unions been to bring medicines to the elderly? Where have the trade unions been to feed the homeless, feed the poor? You just don't see them anywhere, Michael. In Cuba, 28,000 medical students walked out of their dormitories and tested 11 million Cuban citizens. That's the totality of the population of Cuba. 28,000 medical students. I haven't seen a medical student from any American university, public or private, go out and test the public. In fact, you're in New York. I doubt that any state official or quasi-state official has rung your doorbell and said, can I stick this thing up your nose to test you? Nobody, because the state has collapsed in the United States and society is not available. And this is the reason why I believe that in a country like the United States, when anything happens, the tendency to mass rioting is much greater because there's no mediation between the people and their frustrations and the elites. There's no organizations, unions, and so on. People just go out there and they're angry. In other societies, there are mediations. That's the price you pay if you destroy society.
How did Kerala create that trajectory for itself? And in a global age, how can America, even the left in the United States, I know I'm being very critical today, but I wish that the left in the United States, and one of the goals of this show is to have a much more genuinely global perspective. So that even sometimes when we generate movements, there's this idea that we're exporting them versus the sort of the history that, to me, in many ways, you exemplify. One of the reasons I admire your work so much, that this really is a global collaborative endeavor, and it works east, west, north, south. There is a shared working condition that's universal, and there are overlapping trajectories and aspirations, and we can learn from each other. So, and I think Kerala to me is a very striking example of that, a Marxist state or someone Marxist state in India that has this extraordinary performance above its own nation state and very relevant to not only the kind of immediate crisis of COVID, but the underlying conditions you're talking about.
I mean, look, it took 100 years for Kerala to build this. It's not just that there's a communist government in power there. This is part of the history of the state, building public action into the culture of Kerala, into the society of Kerala, the importance of public action and so on. I mean, look, the United States had the importance of public action. It was such an important part of US history until the early 20th century. In a sense, until the Bolshevik Revolution in the USSR, there were very important public institutions of people in the United States, including trade unions, whether it's the old AFL or it's the IWW, the International Workers of the World. And let's not just stay with unions. Let's talk about neighborhood organizations, and then let's talk about church groups and so on. About 20 years ago, an American political scientist by the name of Robert Putnam wrote a book which had a rather silly title, and it seemed anachronistic. He wrote a book called Bowling Alone. And the point of the book was that Americans don't belong to things like bowling leagues and various things where they are organized into groups. Now, Robert, the example of bowling in the 21st century is anachronistic. I mean,
you don't
there's
like
so
bowling,
many.
Vijay?
Look, I don't mind bowling, but to pick bowling leagues and the decline of bowling leagues somehow seemed a little silly. There are other ways of gauging the lack of organized activity. Now, look, let's not exaggerate this, because of course people are organized. Friends have groups. They meet, they party together, they have a good time. There are lots of ways in which people continue to reproduce society. It's not like you're sitting by yourself alone, untethered from other people. No, there are friendship groups. They go play sports together. They play pickup games. There are knitting circles. There are lots of ways in which people are organized. But the issue is, does this social organization translate into public action? And I think that's the real gap. And that gap has come because of the actual quite deliberate attack during the McCarthy period to prevent social groups from public action. So, you have now very sensitive and decent people doing mutual aid in this time of COVID, going out, trying to help their neighbors and so on. But it's not at a big scale. It's small groups. The big organizations, the trade unions and so on, they have had their feet cut from under them. They have been reduced to bargaining units. And one of the things that I think one needs to teach them is what unions used to do in the United States. They used to be a site of working class culture. In a community, the union hall was the place where you rented and you had your marriage there. It was the place where you went on the weekend and heard music. It was the place you played bingo and whatever. Those are anachronistic things. I get it. There are modern ways to use.
You're going to go after bowling and then do that list?
I know, but that was in the past. The issue is where is the union hall today? Right. Where is it? I mean, it doesn't exist. The working class culture is not being held together by these organizations. In other countries, they are. And so that's what we need to actually think about, is the translation of our social networks into public action. And you have to have the experience of public action. You can't wait for an emergency. When an emergency happens, we're paralyzed. We don't know what to do. And I think that's what's happened in many of the advanced industrial countries, where there is a kind of paralysis and the state is also useless, so nothing's happening.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.